Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr. Today I am welcoming Jonathan Foster to the show. Jonathan is an award-winning and Amazon best-selling author. He recently received his doctorate through Northwind Seminary. His dissertation turned to book is called Theology of Consent, Mimetic Theory in an Open and Relational Universe. Today we'll be talking about his book, The Reconstructionist. He's the founder of LoveHaiti.org, has 3 children, and 1 lifelong partner. You can find out more about him at jonathanfosteronline.com. All right, welcome to the show, Jonathan Foster. Thanks so much for being here. Is there anything else you'd like our listeners to know about you?
Hey, Lauren, thank you for having me. It's great. It's an honor to be on with you. And I'm just a guy who's pulling at the thread, the theological thread, as it were, and landing on some really interesting things in my life, been through some stuff. So hopefully listeners can relate.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being here. Talk, if you would, about your journey of faith, what that looked like at the beginning, if there was a beginning, and what that looks like today.
Sure. Yeah. So I came from a pretty, typical, maybe evangelical kind of home, fairly legalistic. My denomination, my background is Church of the Nazarene. My grandparents were pastors. My parents were pastors. It was kind of in my DNA. Not surprisingly, I decided that's what I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
But I went more the church planting route. So I've been a part of 3 church plants. And for the most part, that's been really meaningful. I was just thinking, just yesterday, I was having this conversation, thinking through, gosh, it's crazy how many more meaningful moments I've had with people who are new to the faith versus people who have been in the faith for a long time. It seems like that long-term thing really makes some people not too much fun to be around. So anyhow, church planting was cool. Started a nonprofit in Haiti a few years ago that my oldest son runs now, and that has been super meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
But so the faith background is just growing in that and being a pastor, but then running up against really intense loss and things in my life that put me in a position where I realized that kind of my old theological construct wasn't allowing me to come up with what I decided was healthier answers. And so I had to kind of work through that, which set me down a whole path I wasn't planning on going down, but here we are.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I'm just thinking we were talking before we started recording about Thomas J. Ord, who we both know. I think his book that I think deals with the topic of theodicy is what God can't write.
Yeah, that's his probably most well-known one. Yeah.
I really wrestled with the topic of theodicy through the when bad things happen to good people book. That's such a profound. I don't know about your perspective, Jonathan, but for me at least, like I feel like when someone wrestles with theodicy and someone goes through all that stuff, and like they choose to come out like exactly where they were, like I'm just like, go for it. If that's like what's meaningful for you when you process all your grief and trauma. Like I think of like several years ago, I saw Stephen Chris Chapman in concert, and this was like not too long after that tragic death of his. I think it was his daughter, and
I can't remember.
And he just shared briefly like about going through that process and just choosing to like say, I'm still going to trust that everything. And I just was like, Stephen, I support you. Like, I don't believe the same exact way, but I'm 100% behind you. If that's what's meaningful for you in your life, like I support you in that. Not that we had a personal conversation, but that was kind of my imagined conversation.
Yeah, I relate to that. Like my wife and I frequently say something like, the stuff works until it doesn't work. And then when it doesn't work, that's a really interesting question. Like, as a human being, will you figure out kind of new ways? Will you navigate, negotiate, and change? I don't think there's anything wrong with changing. I think it was Howard Thurman who said, to change is to live, to change often is to live well. And I think there's some truth to that because, nothing really ever stays the same.
Yeah.
But to your point, yes, I recognize all of us are just we're trying to create meaning out of all the absurdity of life. And if you've got something that works for you, I'm more power to you. I mean, as long as it's not disrespectful to others and denigrating to others, which unfortunately sometimes it gets that way. But by and large, go for it.
Yeah. What is a spiritual practice that you find meaningful or has supported you through these recent years?
I think I have gravitated when we went through. So in 2015, like it's talked about in the book a little bit. I don't talk about it a ton in the book, but I definitely reference it. We lost our oldest daughter in a car wreck. So it was a sudden, intense change in our life. And so I really doubled down on a lot of disciplines at the time, including prayer. You might be familiar with Brian Zahn's prayer school. That I kind of was already concocting my own kind of discipline. And then I added some of that and really used that heavily. Use might not be the right word, but I interacted with that heavily for, probably about 5, 6, 7 years, almost daily. And I found that to be incredibly helpful. Part of what he did and what I was doing right during that time was, was really falling in love more with like ancient prayers and trying to definitely do away with, thinking of prayer as getting God to do something and rather more prayer as the thing that helps me be formed in the model of love. And so I would just kind of meditate, and that's an important word for me, on some of these ancient writings and scriptures and prayers that people have written a long time ago, because particularly in the wake of that loss, I really had no prayer other than what the hell just happened. And that was my basic prayer.
Yeah.
And the second part of that was, what does this mean? Which I'm still trying to figure that out basically.
Right.
And it's kind of fueled all of my dissertation work and all my writing. But I would say the prayer piece was super helpful, and it's turned. I mentioned meditation because now over the years it's turned into more of an interest in meditation. So it's gone slightly psychological, but I'm not even sure it's the best way to categorize it, because I don't think that means it's non-spiritual. It's just it's been more of an attunement of my emotional, psychological state in the presence, I think, of God. And I would add to that lots of hiking. I know you live in Colorado. I love Colorado. I'm out there as much as I can be. Getting to the mountains is a huge spiritual practice for me.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I'll just say, like, as a parent, the loss of a child is unimaginable. So my heart just goes out to you and your family, even in the years since. And I pray that you've been able to find some measure of healing in that loss.
Appreciate it. Yeah, it is unimaginable. It's crazy.
Yeah. Let's talk about your book. So this is actually a book that you published, a couple years ago, right?
Yeah. So actually it would have been a year ago, almost right now. So end of 21. Yeah.
Okay. So it's not that old, but the book is The Reconstructionists. People, well, I don't do math, and this is like kind of mathy. People over text, mercy over sacrifice, and love over fear. But share, if you would, kind of like what inspired the book and how that came to be.
Yeah. Well, I was on a journey, like we're all on a journey, and I was a pastor, and I was already kind of reinterpreting things maybe a little bit more progressively than my larger church family. but certainly after my daughter passed away, it was like high octane fuel to this whole thing that we often hear referenced now as deconstruction.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I wasn't necessarily calling it at the time. I wasn't trying to enter into it. I wasn't
Right.
entering into a whole new way of thinking because I was angry. I really wasn't even angry at God. I wasn't angry at the church. And I just mentioned that because sometimes all that baggage is connected with deconstruction.
Yep.
Now,
Yep.
I have had anger since then.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm fine with expressing anger to God. And I'm fine with telling people, yeah, the religious system I was a part of, because long story short, as I talk a bit about in the book, the religious system wound up voting me off the denominational island, as it were. But anyhow, I just started pulling the thread. That's kind of the way I say it.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with George MacDonald. He was a fantasy writer that inspired C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and others, really as much as anyone. And he has a story called The Princess and the Goblin, which I read years ago. And so when I say pull at the thread, I always think of the story because as I remember it, the princess at the beginning of the story was up in her room in the castle. I don't remember if it was the grandmother or the fairy godmother or someone was telling her if she ever gets afraid, there is a spool of invisible thread in the corner of the room. And she could start following that thread and it would lead her to safety. So, of course, as the story goes, she, gets scared one night. She finds that thread. She starts following it. It takes her through the back walls of the castle, places she's never been, down through the basement, out this secret door into a garden and through the forest. And she follows it to the base of a mountain. And when she gets to the mountain, it's covered with boulders, the entrance to this thing that was underneath the mountain. And so it's the middle of the night. Now she's scared. She can't get through the boulders. So she decides to turn around and go back. So she turns around to follow the thread back, only to discover that the thread goes only forward. It doesn't go backward. So when I say pull at the thread, every time I think of that, that's what I was doing. I would pull at this theological, ecclesiological, psychological thread, and I'd get a little ways and I'd be like, oh, crap, I can't do this. I got to turn around and go back, only to realize there is no going back. It's just going forward by faith. And so I kept pulling at the thread, and it landed me on Rene Girard mimetic theory stuff. It landed me into open and relational theology stuff. Sorry, I'll answer the question now. That's a deconstruction. All of that was deconstructing, but I was really interested in reconstructing. I wasn't. I'm totally fine. In fact, I probably encourage people to disassemble their faith, especially lots of folks who've been hurt by a lot of different things. But I also felt compelled for my boys and for my nieces and nephews and young people in our church to try to reassemble it. So I was like, what could we write and what could I engage with to help me reconstruct? And I realized at some point in about 2020, all my deconstruction, reconstruction journey was filtered through those three things that you just read, that mercy is greater than sacrifice, people are greater than the rules, and love is greater than fear.
Well, thanks for sharing that. So I want to highlight a few quotes from your book, and have you reflect on those. One thing that really stuck out to me. I want to read this. You write, having been in the local church your entire life, you genuinely think most Christians don't possess love for themselves. You say, I think they possess resentment, shame, anger, and fear, or it possesses them. That really struck me, especially that last sentence.
Yeah, I think that's probably accurate. That's still my view. I don't think most Americanized Christians have really had... Let's see. I don't want this to sound disrespectful if people are listening and they're like, well, don't tell me. I'll just qualify this by saying, having been a pastor and interacted with a lot of people over the years, and also interacting with the voices in my own head, and what the Bible has to say, and trying to exegete the Bible and culture and what my people are going through. I think it's true that most people have not been able to allow love to sink to the depths of their heart, where it's dissipated the shame. And so that shame lives, the guilt lives. It's probably synonymous terms, shame, maybe some guilt, this really strong awareness that we have, not met up to certain expectations, whether they're our own or someone else's. And that thing sits in there and it festers and it metastasizes. And we kind of try to suppress it, but that suppression turns into repression, and then it manifests itself in some really weird ways. And so somehow in the middle of all that, I think that what I think is it goes from us hanging on to this shame and bitterness kind of stuff, and then it somehow mutates into, well, it starts to hang on to us. And that's problematic. I mean, all of that's problematic, but that's tough because then you can't, repression, you don't really control. Suppression, you kind of control, if I understand in a psychological sense. But repression, you don't really control what's going on. It's a lot of subconscious stuff. And there is a lot of, this as a pastor, there's a lot of subconscious, dysfunctional, psychospiritual drama going on with people in the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, we don't have time to talk about it. Maybe when I have you on again for your next book, hopefully.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's a relation here between atonement theory, right, and this deep shame and guilt.
For sure. Yeah. And that was a big linchpin thing for me. So yeah, let's get on again and talk about that.
Another quote from the book, which I think is interesting. You write that for many of us, God is simply a projection of who we are. And this stood out to me because I think this is an accusation that folks who find themselves on the left side of the theological spectrum often get accused of from those on the right. But I think if we're being honest, like I think it's something we all do. I'll say that. So I guess A is like, how do we recognize we're doing that? And B, like, what do we do about it?
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, I do think the left gets accused of that, but probably the right does too. I think we all tend to point our fingers at everyone else. I think self-awareness is huge. I really think that that's an important discipline and practice to participate in, to try to learn as much about ourselves so that we can give as much of ourselves away. That is a phrase, and I apologize, I don't know where this quote comes from, but what I'm thinking of when I say that is I grew up in a context, I'm probably a little bit older than you, but I grew up in a pretty conservative, legalistic context. Good home, by the way. My parents were great. Family was great, but there was just a lot of that baggage. And in that particular context, like back then, even going to a psychologist was not something anyone encouraged. And it was even said to me, if you see a therapist, basically psychology, the gospel is denying yourself and therapy is trying to get you to accept yourself. And I remember I never liked that, but it took me a while to figure out, no, I think of what's good about counseling and therapy and then also self-awareness is this idea of, getting to know yourself so that you can then willingly lay yourself down and enter into, whatever love's inviting you to enter into. So the more you get to know yourself, the more you realize, oh my word, I project and potentially transfer, which is a very similar thing, psychologically project. I project all the time onto people, and why wouldn't I do that with God? And I think that we do, especially when we create God to be, your earlier question about shame. It's so much a part of who we are, and then so we project onto God, and we just assume then that God has to punish us and is angry with us, and that seems really strong. So I'm rambling a bit. How do we not do that? There's probably 100 different ways, but one is to get to know yourself. And I think that's a really honorable, good thing to do.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Something else that stood out to me from the book, you write that the cross has become an object of magic, symbolizing what Jesus did rather than the way. And I think of what's the word? Like a totem. Am I thinking the right word?
The totem?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of like this magical symbol. And I'm also reminded perhaps we could collaborate on this. Like many years ago in seminary, I wrote a paper on why the cross should stop being like a foundational symbol for Christianity. Classic like seminary hot take paper, but share more about, how you think the cross as a symbol perhaps has, I don't know, what would you say, lost its purpose, lost its true meaning?
Yeah, I think what I was thinking when I was writing that was this idea that it's so easy to gather on a Sunday morning and to sing about God and to worship God for what his son Jesus did on the cross, and to slowly, which I think is what has happened, slowly over time allowed, layer after layer of somewhat magical, mythical thinking like that event was this transactional event that changed everything. I do think it was an event that did something, but I don't think it was transactional, like Jesus had to do this to get God's attention.
Mm-hmm.
And so really well-intentioned Christians, because I think for the most part, that's what we have.
Mm-hmm.
We have well-intentioned people who gather and they want to worship that particular thing. But the more you talk about it and worship it, sometimes the less you have to enter into it yourself. We can kind of separate it as this superhuman, transactional, unbelievable thing we can't even understand. Now we're saved, and then we leave and we go do our thing, come back the next Sunday, worship it all over again. And I think that is at best misguided. At worst, it's manipulative and completely wrong, because it doesn't really ask of us anything.
Mm-hmm.
It just tells us to worship something, and which is kind of good, but worship that doesn't lead to a life change, I think is pointless, and probably worse than pointless.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? Because, and I'm going to speak a bit broadly here of the quote unquote evangelical church scene, right?
Mm-hmm.
The worship experience, which is often just the music experience, really is contextual there. I guess most pastors would try to have some kind of relevant teaching that folks could apply elsewhere. But from my perspective, at least, that's, I think, one of the challenges of church is how to get people to take their faith and implement it into the Monday through Saturday life.
Yeah.
You're a pastor, like, maybe I'm getting too practical here.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do we need to reimagine, re-envision, redo what the elements of the traditional Sunday morning worship experience are? What do you think?
Hey, yeah, let's do that. Let's reimagine. Let's redo. Let's try some new stuff. I think that's what needs to happen. And let's try some new theological constructs that undergird all this new stuff. And absolutely, I think we should experiment. I think we should have a sense of playfulness with this. I know those are basically, those are terms that are antithetical to church in most respects. And I think we've just done ourselves a disservice, because the point I'm trying to make, and I think you're trying to make, is that this stuff has to kind of make sense in the real world. And far too often we create these spaces where we bring people in, they do a few things, and then they leave. And it doesn't affect them. I'm hesitating now because I just wanted to pause for a second and say that's not always the church's fault. That's not always the pastor's fault.
Yeah.
You're right.
Amen to that.
Yeah. There are churches and pastors who really care a lot about this. A lot of times it's, the person, for a variety of different reasons, just simply cannot or will not enter into this thing at a deeper level. And so I know that's deeply frustrating as a pastor when that happens.
Yeah. So let me have you respond to one more quote here. You write, "The sacrifice isn't enough. Fear never lasts. rules eventually birth resentment. Our only hope is love. One, like I want to say, like, yeah, 100%, Jonathan. The other part of me wants to be like, come on, enough wishy-washiness. Like, we've been trying this love is
Yeah.
love thing, how for the skeptical among us, we might say,
Sure.
give me some more.
Yeah. Well, I do think that I recognize that a part of my journey over the last several years, and I think this is true of a lot of people, is I had to redefine certain words, and love was one of them. But there were a lot of words, and it's interesting because it's kind of like you have two options when you're going through this, and neither of them, both of them are really hard work. Like you can either make up new language, which I have done that at times, but as anyone knows, like to learn new language, it's really hard.
Yeah.
We've been going to Haiti for the last 7 years now. And I think I've learned, some new phrases. And I get down there and I realize it's just really hard, especially as an adult to kind of rewire your brain. So you can learn new language, which is helpful, but that's hard. But you can also then rehabilitate old words, but that's also hard.
Yeah.
Because when you say a word, like let's say sacrifice, in my 20s and 30s, when I thought of sacrifice, my brain went, it was to get into psychodynamics philosophy, it was a signifier of a word. It signified a whole bunch of things. Now, when I say it, it signifies something else. This is true of love. Love, unfortunately, in the English language is just used for everything. I love my wife. I love the Kansas City Chiefs. I love Mexican food. I mean, I love God. So what I felt like I was invited to do was to really unpack a bunch of things. And love happens to be something I'm super interested in. I think it becomes the most important topic. So now when I think of love, my brain immediately goes to nonviolent, non-binary, non-scapegoating love. Those are three very intentional moves that I definitely wasn't doing, 10 years ago. But now, because I've thought through and I've read and I've written about binary stuff and same with violence and definitely with scapegoating, because my dissertation wound up doing a ton of that stuff. That's just where my head goes. But it took me a while. It took me a while to get there. I should mention Tom Ord's definition of love. His definition goes something like it's an intentional move that in relationship with God and others for well-being. So, factoring in those things and factoring in non-binary, non-violent, non-scapegoating, all of a sudden you have a concept of love that is the furthest thing from wishy-washy. It is a challenging concept that I started to say requires. It invites me to work through what I think about power and controlling and how we use things, how things use us. It's a deeply complex, rich word. So that's kind of where I'm going, and I think you're right. If without having some of that understanding and idea, it can come across like a little bit anemic and thin.
Well, I think this fits into the broader conversation we're having here and the theme of your book of Reconstructing. I don't know, this is maybe I'm speaking for myself here, but I feel like I almost had to begin to redefine words, especially words around faith. I grew up very independent Baptist, very conservative. So I remember, I went to a mainline seminary and, tried to learn the language, Holy One, for prayers, Holy One, and, one beyond our being, and all these kind of elaborate words for God and prayer just didn't have the same, they didn't mean the same thing to me. They just seemed not me, not in line with my faith tradition. But also I still had all this kind of theological baggage and attachment to the word God or other faith words. So I really had to, in a way, redefine, and probably still am redefining and reconstructing those words in my head when I use those words. So I think it really fits here with your broader theme.
Yeah, that's a great point, because all words, they constantly have to be redefined. This is actually the heart of deconstruction. If we wanted to talk about Jacques Derrida and where deconstruction came from, it's metonymy. It's the idea that all words are defined by other words. If you go to the dictionary and you look at a word, it'll send you to other words. And when you look up those words, you go to more words. The reality is it kind of never stops. And I think there's a lot of, what's the word? I started to say power. I don't know that that's the right word. But that there's a lot of grace. We will help ourselves if we just admit that, because a lot of folks want to shame people for deconstructing, when I think the truth is that's a whole piece of it, but it's not necessarily just to tear down. So I don't blame people who have been hurt and who just want to tear down. It's to redefine and reassemble and reconstruct. I think there's so much beauty in that.
Yeah. So I'm a pastor, someone who loves the church, even though, I've dealt with a fair bit of junk from the church. But like you, I think like you at least, I'm very much on the reconstruction path and encourage that for people. So you have what I think is really helpful, I think at least, a path that I kind of want to talk through. And again, it's the broader theme of this book of love over fear, mercy over sacrifice, and people over text. And maybe let me respond to these, and I want to hear your feedback. But love over fear, again, growing up very conservative, fear was like the name of the game. Like we were taught to like live in fear of God, of our sin, of hell, of the rapture, of everything. So, when I said that thing about, is love that kind of wishy-washy thing, that's my subconscious, like passive, like, love isn't enough. It has to be fear. So talk through that, flipping that dynamic of why love needs to be greater than fear.
Yeah, you're so right. Fear is almost the whole thing. I couldn't believe a few years ago, I'll try to make a long story short, but when I started to really highlight love and inclusivity over against fear and exclusivity, and it led me down this path of reconsidering LGBTQ human beings, and I realized that I had been scapegoating them probably, and that for sure my denomination had been. But I couldn't believe over the course of about 2 years, as I changed my posture and as I began to speak and preach and teach differently about it, how many people wanted to talk to me about hell. So, we'd go to coffee and, we'd be talking about LGBTQ matters. And then their next question was, well, do you not believe in hell? And I'm like, first of all, I don't know if I do or not. Let's define hell, talk about a word that needs to be redefined. Secondly, even if I did, or whatever I do, there's about 49 steps in between what you just said and hell. And what I realized after a while was how much fear motivated us, and how we were just conditioned, especially in religious circles, to think in terms of what we're going to lose rather than what we might gain.
Yeah.
That's just one tiny way that love refracts differently for me now than it used to. And I just kept thinking, fear is not a hard thing to do. Sometimes that's the way I think about it. I think like, what's a harder way to go?
Yeah.
Love is a harder way to go. Oh, I bet that's the way that God goes then too, because God is love. And if it was easy, any old God could do that. I think the harder thing is to love in non-binary, non-violent, non-scapegoating ways, intentionally for, in relationship with others for their well-being. Fear just, I give fear its due. I'm thankful it can come along for the ride. It's helped me sometimes not to get hurt, but it doesn't get to call the shots anymore. I'm not afraid of God. I remember the first time I said that on a Sunday morning. Half the church gasped.
Yeah.
And internally, I kind of gasped.
Right.
But then I was like, as soon as I said it, I thought, no, that's true. I'm not afraid of God. I'm afraid of what some of you people are going to do to me now that I just admitted I'm not afraid of God. But I think love is stronger. Yeah.
The next kind of marker along the path is mercy over sacrifice. And one of the things I appreciated in the book is you kind of, I think, if I remember correctly, you kind of acknowledge like there is this tension in the scriptures, in the Bible, about like what is the best way, mercy or sacrifice. So I appreciate you acknowledging that tension. But again, I'm thinking here. I think this again, like an example of like immigration or legal quote unquote immigration. I think there's this kind of like framework of like, well, we had this universal way, which again, what sacrifice was there, but that's another conversation. Like, we had to suffer, we sacrificed, so they need to sacrifice too. And I think that plays into so much of our, broadly speaking, politic and attitude, at least amongst perhaps white Americans. Whereas having an attitude of mercy, boy, it just changes the dynamic, flips the script completely. Talk more about that different approach.
These are such huge questions that, you can't even get to the bottom to in an episode or even a book. But I think you're so right. I think we are marked by sacrifice. I think we have an obsession with it, and it's closely related to fear. Mm-hmm. I think driven by our fear to make something of ourselves, we have created this narrative that the only way to get there is if we just, beat ourselves up. Mm-hmm. And if we can't beat ourselves up, we'll beat others up. I notice this all the time, like even watching a football game. You listen to the commentators and they will, which first of all, I don't begrudge anyone the idea that, hard work is important.
Right.
I mean,
right.
It is important. I mean, you work hard, I work hard. So that's not the deal. But I'm really aware now of how often you'll hear the announcers talk about this guy gets up at 6 a.m, or this guy gets up at 5 a.m. This guy sleeps at the facility. Mm-hmm. And then of course, when they win the championship, it's all supposed to be worth it. There's so many 1,000 sub stories that are going on with all of that. Work hard, but there are other things in life. Things in life can happen really good that you can't sacrifice for. In fact, that's what grace is. Grace is the realization that you can't control anything, and you can sacrifice the hell out of your life. That's an interesting phrase. Maybe that's a Freudian slip.
Yeah.
Maybe you really can. You can sacrifice everything and stuff can still go poorly. And then it leaves you at the end of the day with this question of, well, what does this mean?
So I want to jump on that if I can, Jonathan, because the other thought that comes to mind here is, again, I imagine you were trained this way in ministry like I was, of ministry being just about giving till you have nothing left or nearly nothing left. Whereas much of what I was encouraged in my CPE chaplaincy journey was giving out of the overflow. I mean, the concept of being merciful to yourself, I think, is almost antithetical to the way many pastors and church leaders were trained to go about ministry, which I think fits into this broader theme, right?
Definitely. That's a really good insight. It's so true. I think most pastors intuit it. Most pastors understand that the importance of what we're talking about, but then to be able to rewire themselves, so to speak, and reorient themselves around a merciful, gracious posture towards themselves, which goes back to the very first question. Like, most people have never really engaged with love. I think you're probably right. Most spiritual leaders, maybe even most of all, which is part and parcel of the problem, really into sacrifice, will sacrifice ourselves. I will say some of the work I did in the book that will be out by the time this show comes out too, following the Reconstructionists, was the finishing of my dissertation. I really engaged with sacrifice a little bit because it's not as if you can get away from it totally. It is a biblical word, and we all know that there is maybe altruistic, self-donative kind of sacrifice. So I had to struggle with that, and I landed on this idea of reflexive versus non-reflexive. So in the English language, verb-wise, reflexive verbs are verbs where the subject basically consents. Consensual consent is a really big topic for me now. Mm-hmm. So the subject willingly steps into it. Non-reflexive is when the subject it's forced upon him. So I say in there it's the difference between verbing and being verbed.
This is great. I love it.
No one wants to be verbed,
Yeah.
And I think all of this is also reflective of the way that Jesus operates in life.
Yeah.
Once you have the lens to see it, you realize he's not doing this stuff non-reflexively. He is intentionally, he says even, I can lay down my life and I have the power to pick it back up.
Yeah.
He intentionally enters into all this stuff. It's very complex, but I love that because it frees me from the idea that God needs me to sacrifice. I don't think God needs me to do anything. I think God is actually pretty happy with me. But there is something about the way the universe is threaded together where reflexive sacrifice seems to fuel a lot of stuff.
It also reminds me of boundaries, which is a term that often gets talked about in my context, how that, we all need to have boundaries. We can choose to cross those boundaries, to sacrifice our own boundaries, but it has to be it's supposed to be our choice. Like if you have the boundary, Jonathan, of I'm not going to do podcasts at, before whatever time this is on Thursday mornings, that can be your boundary, and I can ask you and you can say no. Or you can say yes, but that's your choice, not me saying, hey, Jonathan, we're going to do this podcast at this time on Thursday morning, right?
Yes. I think it's so true. And the more we can empower people to think that way, I think the more we're doing the work of love.
Okay, I got to ask you one more question here before we take a break. I know we're running a bit long on time here. So the last marker along this path, which again I think is kind of like whoa, but I think it is interesting. People over text, and again, my kind of ingrained conservative Baptist in me is whoa, people over text. Whoa, slow down there. Talk me through that.
Yeah, heretic. Right. And so all three of these things, just as a reminder, are things that I realized as all of my deconstruction and reconstruction journey was being filtered through those three things. Love is greater than fear. Sacrifice is greater than mercy. And this people are greater than the text. And all of them are reflective of the way Jesus lived, which helps me. And when I thought about the way Jesus interacted with folks, of course, I realized there isn't one instance where he applies the rule of the text over against a person in a way that would bind the person up, in a way that would be non-consensual to the person, that would cross their borders and boundaries. I think I mentioned it in the Reconstructionist. There's one enigmatic story of when he's is it the Syrophoenician woman that he's interacting with, and it's the whole, even the dog gets the bread of the crumbs. Right. That one's weird because he starts out a little sarcastic, but even if we admit that, by the end, it's clear that he's super impressed with this lady, and all the rest of the stories, it's just overwhelming evidence that people to Jesus were really, really important, and that, man was made for the Sabbath, or no, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That's kind of it in a nutshell right there. And we really do ourselves a disservice when we worship the words of the Bible so much that we denigrate, disrespect, and exclude people.
Well, that's a good way to let's leave it right there. That's a good ending. So the book is The Reconstructionist.
You got it.
People over text, mercy over sacrifice, and love over fear. Share before we take a break how people can. Oh, actually, no. Let's do that at back end here. The Reconstructionist. Okay. Let's take a break. We'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with Jonathan Foster. So some closing questions. You can take these as seriously or not as you'd like to. But if you're Pope for a day, what does that day look like? What do you want to do?
Well, first of all, I've been taking all your questions as serious or not serious as I want to.
That's good.
If I'm Pope for a day, I would literally spend the entire day trying to understand the Catholic theology so that I could figure out what I'm supposed to do, because I don't know it well enough.
Fair enough. A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Jeez. There's a lot. I mean, it would be weird for me not to say René Girard, though he just passed away in 2015. I suppose in the spirit of where I'm at in life right now, I'd go René Girard and Alfred North Whitehead.
Yeah. Okay. What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
Good grief. I don't know. No one knows the future. By the way, I don't even think God knows the exact future.
Oh, hot take there.
I know. Hot take. Exactly. I suppose where my brain goes is that this was a pivotal time and that this was the time. It'll probably be one of two things. I've either learned how to give grace to ourselves and others so that we don't scapegoat and blow up the world, or it'll be the other part. That was another instance where humans couldn't give grace to themselves and they blew up the world.
Well, I hope it's the former, not the latter.
Me too. That is why you too probably. So I'm doing my work.
Yeah. Something hopeful. What do you hope for the future of Christianity?
That we don't scapegoat and blow up the world.
That's good.
One in the same.
All right, here we are. Where can people connect with you and talk about your book that you have coming out here real soon?
Yeah, thank you. So we've been kind of talking around the book, The Reconstructionist. And the most recent thing I've done is I just finished up a 3-year study where I attempted to bring René Girard's mimetic theory in concert with open and relational theology, which is kind of process theology influenced. So that's been a super interesting journey. And that book's called Theology of Consent. You can find those books and other things that I've done at all fine digital retailers, the Amazons and the Kobos and the Apples, Barnes & Noble. But probably the easiest way to connect with me is to go to jonathanfosteronline.com.
Great. Well, again, for our listeners, I highly recommend the book we talked about today, The Reconstructionist. I really enjoyed it. Encourage folks to check out that and then his forthcoming book here. But Jonathan, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate the conversation. I always leave folks with a word of peace, so may God's peace be with you.
Thank you. I accept that, and may you have peace as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romig-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.